have a meet recently, not too long ago. I was on Metro, taking the Metro into Washington, D.C. Pretty busy time. The car that I was in was pretty packed. I was sitting very close to the door. We're going to get in and out of the train on the aisle, packed, crowded. And we stop at this one stop, and a whole bunch of people get in, and as soon as the doors close and the train takes off, this man who just got on the train announces in a very loud voice, "May I have your attention, please?" And he got our attention, because people don't do that on the Metro. It's not a written rule, but it's an unwritten rule. You don't talk on the Metro. Everybody's doing something on their phone, so he got our attention. And just to make sure, in case we might have missed something, the woman sitting right across the aisle from me, right over there, started screaming, "No! No! No!" I thought, we're going to be on the 11 o'clock news. And everybody in the car was doing what I was looking at him. Okay. And then he reached into his pocket. And I thought, did I tell my wife I love her this morning? And he pulls out a book, and he starts to sing, "Blessed assurance, Jesus is mine." And everybody sighed a sigh of relief, went back to their phones, and they rolled their eyes. Everybody except the woman next to me, who continued to scream, "Shut up! Stop!" It was the oddest duet I've ever heard. Did you know that hymn has 4 verses? Anyway, so he sang them all. So, I've been thinking about that ever since that wonderful moment. I'll bet a lot of people in the world think that's what it means to be a Christian, to get up on subway cars and sing "Blessed Assurance." And I'm a Christian, and I don't do that, and I would never do that. When the train stopped at the next stop, he said, the doors opened up, he said, "Have a nice day," and he stepped out, and I said, "Okay." And then everybody looked at the woman who was screaming, she was beet red next to me, and she said, "I have to put up with him every day." Oh, he does this every day. They were riding Metro again. I thought I would walk to work, no matter where I worked. But so I really have been thinking, I wonder if that's what a lot of people think, that that's what it means to be a Christian. I also wonder if a lot of people think, are those my only 2 options? The guy who stands there singing "Blessed Assurance" on the subway, or the woman who screams "No, no, no"? Are those the only 2 options? And I think that there are a whole lot of people in between. I can't do it because this mic won't go. What if you could? Well, I will. I'll just be loud. Okay, imagine a line suspended in midair, okay? And it's like a spectrum. So over here are really, really, really religious people who sing "Blessed Assurance" on subway cars. And I just need to get the exercise. And over here are people who scream and yell, "No, no, no, shut up." I just think there's a whole lot of people in between. And I think that a lot of Christians have conversations with their friends who may be outsiders or different faiths or no faith or no religion. And they know how to have a conversation about here, usually with something like, "Would you like to believe in Jesus as your Lord and Savior?" But I just think there's a whole lot of people who, that question doesn't even make sense. Now, I know this because I used to be somewhere around here. And I had lots of friends in a Christian youth group in high school who used to say to me, "Would you like to believe in Jesus as your Lord and Savior?" And I would think, I'm Jewish, and Jewish people don't do that with Jesus. We might be a little, I don't know how far I'm going to go. But I was somewhere over here, and I remember, I didn't really know a whole lot about Jesus at all. My dad used his name a lot of times, but not the way that Christians were using it. And I thought, I got a whole lot of questions about this Jesus guy before I'm ready to think about it in the category of Lord and Savior. And I will tell you, I did become a believer in Jesus 4 years later after my sophomore year of college. So I just think there's a whole lot of conversations that need to happen here. And I'm hoping that if you're here tonight and you're somewhere in this side of the spectrum, that this will be helpful for you. I'm also hoping that if you are a Christian, that this will give you some ideas about how you can have conversations with friends who are perhaps somewhere on this side of the spectrum. So I call this talk Considering Faith in a Secular Age, or Considering Faith in an Age of Doubt. And so what I want to give you are considerations, ways to even think about thinking about God. By the way, I thought about calling it that, the title of the thing, Thinking About God, and I thought nobody would come. So I'm really glad that you came and that Greg Burrows convinced me to use a different title. So I want to give you 4 considerations, and then I'm going to open it up for questions and see if I can help you wherever you're at on that spectrum. Okay? So 4 considerations as we think about thinking about God, or we consider faith in a secular age. Okay? So first consideration is this. We should consider that faith may be inevitable rather than optional. Excuse me, I should consider that faith may be inevitable rather than optional. Here's what I mean. I think a whole lot of people think that faith is something you have or you don't have. Some people are people of faith, some people are not people of faith. But I think as more and more people think about this, write about it, study it, they're finding that everybody has a kind of faith. Now, they may not call it a religious faith, but everyone places their trust, their hope, their sense of being in something bigger than themselves, or at least the vast majority of people think. They think there's got to be more to life than this, and I'm going to find it in a relationship, a career, in pleasure, in some kind of cause, some kind of thing that's bigger than me. And whatever you put that kind of trust or hope or reliance on, that is a kind of faith. By the way, I just was reminded of this the other day. So my name is Randy Newman. You may know there's another guy named Randy Newman who wrote the music to Toy Story. You know this? You've seen? Okay, so when he won his Academy Award several years ago, I got a lot of congratulatory emails. It was really fun. He just recently put together a randynewman.com website, which I'm very thankful for, because for a while I had a randydavidnewman.com website, because I put the David in there because that is my middle name, but I thought this might help to not attract the other Randy Newman strap. But still, I got lots and lots of emails from people who thought I was that other guy. Hey man, I love your music. Lots of people wrote to me asking if I could help them get their music published. Randy Newman also wrote a song called Short People. It sounds like it was making fun of short people, it really wasn't, but short people hate that song, and people hate me, even when they find I'm not that guy, it doesn't matter, guilt by association. So I did get one email once from a guy who told me he was 5'6", and that song ruined his life, and then it was the most profanity-laden email I've ever seen. It's like, wow. One guy even invited me to sing You've Got a Friend in Me at his daughter's wedding. I love that. And he said he was a man of means and would make it worth my while. And so I said, yes. I'm kidding you. And then I felt like, well, that's something you should probably know, and then it never didn't really happen. Anyway, but just the other day, I got an email, again, from someone who thought I was the Randy Newman. And by the way, so I put together kind of like this standard response. I was getting so many of these things. And I wrote to people, if you take a closer look at my website, you'll see I'm in a different line of work than the Randy Newman who wrote Toy Story. But I help people with another story. And if I can help you with a faith story, let me know. So this guy wrote me the other day, and he said, oh, I'm not a person of faith. And then he said, although I've graduated from hostility to people of faith. I thought, oh, that's good. So he moved from, I don't know, I didn't know him back when he was there, but he moved here. And so now we've had this dialogue going back and forth. But he said he's not a person of faith, and I want to say everyone is a person of faith. Everyone places their trust and their hope and their affections on something. Maybe you know the fiction writer David Foster Wallace, an amazing writer. He was considered the greatest writer of his generation. He did a commencement address at Kenyon College, and that address famously then got published as a very small book, something like What is Water? Because he does this thing about water in there. But in the course of that speech, he said this. Here's something else that's true. In the day-to-day trenches of adult life, there is actually no such thing as atheism. There is no such thing as not worshiping. Everybody worships. The only choice we get is what to worship. And an outstanding reason for choosing some sort of God or spiritual type thing to worship, whether it's Jesus or Allah or Yahweh or the wicked mother goddess or the Four Noble Truths or any other infrangible set of ethical principles, is that pretty much anything else that you worship will eat you alive. Listen, he said, if you worship money and things, if they are where you tap real meaning into life, then you will never have enough. You'll never feel that you have enough. It's the truth. If you worship your own body and beauty and sexual allure, you will always feel ugly. And when time and age start showing, you will die a million deaths before they finally plant you. On one level, we all know that this stuff is true. It's been codified into myths, proverbs, cliches, bromides, epigrams, parables, the skeleton of every great story. The trick is keeping the truth up front in your daily consciousness. If you worship power, you will feel weak and afraid, and you will need ever more power over other people to keep the fear at bay. Worship your intellect, being seen as smart, you will end up feeling stupid, a fraud, always on the verge of being found out. Ouch. I think he's onto something, and I think he's right, that we need to be honest with ourselves and ask, what is it that is, if it was taken away, you would feel that your life is meaningless? What is it that you set your affections on and get your hopes up for, and if you don't ever get it, it will be crushing? Whatever that is your functional God. So, faith may be inevitable rather than optional. Second thing to consider, when it comes to thinking about many motives rather than just one, we may have a whole host of motives shaping and affecting the way we approach God or faith or meaning in life or our future or whatever we set our life direction on. We are multifaceted creatures. We're not just intellects, but we have emotions, we have social connections, we have a physical body, we have longings and hopes and desires. And it may be that our motives for pursuing things may have a whole host of those motives, and we need to be honest about that. A lot of times, faith or pursuing God or whatever is offered as a set of intellectual arguments. And I think those arguments are very, very helpful. When I was a sophomore in college, I read a whole lot. I read part of the Bible, I read books by C.S. Lewis, I read a number of philosophers, I read about other religions. So information and intellect and cognitive content is very important. But we approach this whole subject with a whole lot of motives, not just one. So, perhaps you know Christopher Hitchens, the atheist who wrote the book, God Is Not Great, Why Religion Ruins Everything. You might guess that I disagree with Christopher Hitchens on a few things, but I really loved his writing. I thought he was a brilliant writer. He would have some sentences that I would read and stop and pause and reread and think, this guy's a genius. And he wrote about politics, he wrote about religion, he wrote about all sorts of different things. And I just found him to be a fascinating character and quite funny. I love listening to him being interviewed. And he wrote a memoir about his life that he called Hitch 22. And in that memoir, he tells about his mother. His mother's name was Yvonne, and the very first chapter of the book is named Yvonne. And I heard an interview of him on NPR right after that book came out, and the interviewer asked, I was kind of interested about the very first chapter being named for your mom. And this is what Christopher Hitchens said on NPR in response. He said, my father was, as you say, a lifelong Navy man, so I had this rather morose Tory in my background, who was hit off rather brilliantly by contrast by my mother, who I always called Yvonne, and I call her Yvonne in my first chapter, because it's a stylish name, and because she was a stylish girl. Her story is a tragic one, I'm sorry to say, and it ended tragically, in that having waited, I think, rather too long, because divorce and separation were extremely frowned upon in that set in those days, she did take up with another man after my brother and I had grown up, and it didn't quite work out. In fact, it didn't work out at all, and they made a decision to put an end to their lives, and they committed suicide together in Athens. I remember when I was driving outside Chicago, listening to this on NPR, and I had to pull off the road and get into a parking lot because I was so struck by the weight of that. And he paused, and the interviewer didn't say anything, and there was this moment of silence, and then he said, "I think I had a chance to save her, and I failed to grasp it. She tried to call me from Athens and failed, though I might have just missed the call by a few minutes, I don't know. But I've always been certain that if she had heard my voice, she wouldn't have gone through with it. So I've been trying to write my way out of that ever since." All of a sudden, when I heard that, I started replaying things that I had read about Christopher Hitchens and read by Christopher Hitchens, and I thought, oh, there's a whole lot of other stuff going on, rather than just my arguments are better than your arguments. And I think that's true for all of us, and no matter where you're at in the question about God or faith or whatever, it's important to evaluate all of the longings and motives that you may have within you. Aldous Huxley, an English writer and philosopher, said, he was an atheist, I had motives for not wanting the world to have any kind of meaning, and consequently I assumed that it had not. And I was able, without any difficulty, to find satisfying reasons for that assumption. The philosopher who finds no meaning for this world is not concerned exclusively with the problem of pure metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there is no valid reason why he personally should not do as he wants to. For myself, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument for liberation, both sexual and political. I admire the honesty. He was saying he wanted the universe to have no meaning because meaningless allows him to do what he wants. And so what we need to be honest with ourselves and say, okay, what are all of my longings? And what are my motivations? When I was challenged by some Christian friends to read the Gospel of Matthew and to read C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, I took both of those away with me to college, but I didn't read them. Because for the first year and a half in my college days, I majored in beer. The transcript said music, but if you analyze hours spent, it was kind of good. And so I didn't want this Christianity stuff to be true because I was pretty sure that if I became a Christian, I might have to stop getting drunk. And I was kind of convinced by some of the arguments, but then I read in C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, the chapter on hope, where he said, "Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger, well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world." And so I had to be honest about what my motives were before I seriously considered the claims that Jesus made. So we need to consider that our motives may be multiple rather than just one. Third consideration. A third consideration I hope you'll entertain is that confidence may be more realistic than certainty. What I mean is, as you're pursuing this idea of who is God, what does it mean to know God, how do I connect with this God, if you're holding out for 100% absolute certainty without any doubts, you may never ever move forward. I think confidence, a reasonable confidence, is more realistic than absolute certainty. Absolute certainty, I think, is more of a term that comes out of the Enlightenment, and it has an exalted view of human reason. Sometimes people think that term absolute certainty comes from the world of science. But I've talked to enough scientists, and when I was with Crew on this campus, I did a lot of things with professors, and I found that scientists are one of the quickest ones to admit, oh, there's still so much that we still don't know. And so for them, it's reasonable confidence to believe something rather than absolute certainty. One of the professors that used to teach here, I think he may still be here, Mike Summers in physics and astronomy, he was part of the group from NASA that was sending a probe and an exploratory mission to Pluto. For years, I used to stop by his office, and he had a bumper sticker on his door that said, "My other vehicle is on its way to Pluto." And I thought, I bet a lot of people don't have that on their door or car, anywhere, whatever. But for years, he worked together with NASA on this mission to Pluto. And when they finally got there and collected all sorts of data and came back, he said, I said, what were some of the biggest things that you learned? He said, what we learned was how much we didn't know. He said, one of the greatest things about this were all the surprises. There were all sorts of assumptions that we had that proved to be wrong. There were things that we didn't know that we found out. There were so many surprises. And so again, I think the idea, that, if that's true about Pluto, I imagine it's also true in a great way about God. Maybe we can settle for reasonable confidence rather than absolute certainty. Years ago, I was just beginning a doctoral program in intercultural studies, and I realized that I had a computer from so far back. It was like 2 years old, and I needed to update it. That may have been as funny as I was going to get all night. Moment of sadness, sorrow. Okay, go on, keep going. Anyway, so I went to the Apple store to buy myself a new computer because I was starting this doctoral program, and so I met with one of the salesmen, and they showed me different, MacBook Pro, the MacBook, size, and all that kind of stuff, and we're making decisions. And then the guy said to me, "So you're starting a doctoral program? What is it in?" I said, "It's in intercultural studies." He said, "What's that?" I said, I'm a little unclear myself. But I said, well, it's actually kind of about how the Christian faith intersects with other faiths. And he said something that's really interesting that I haven't forgotten. He said, "Oh, I used to be a Christian, but I'm not anymore." I said, "Oh, what happened?" He said, "I just realized I had too many doubts and too many questions, and I wasn't 100% sure." And I said, "Oh, I'm not 100% sure." He says, "Really?" I said, "No, I'm like in the low to mid 90s on most days. When it's rainy for the 4th day in a row, not that I'm complaining, or that might have happened recently, but it's, dips down below, high 80s or so." And he said, "Really? You're not 100% sure?" "No." He says, "And you're going to go get a doctorate in this?" I said, "That might lower the percentage." So I said, "Oh, no, I think low to mid 90s is pretty good. I think my beliefs rest on the historic evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and that's really pretty good. It's really strong. But every time there's a difficulty in the world, like a crime or a horrible storm or suffering or whatever, I really struggle with that. That has always been a struggle for me. I think I have less struggle with that than before, but I think that's always going to be a cause for a limp for me. And so this Apple salesman was kind of surprised that you could be a Christian and still have doubts. Maybe you know the name Anthony Flew. He was a philosopher, a leading philosopher. His textbook on basic introductory philosophy was used at more than any introductory philosophy courses for a long time. He was a strong atheist for many, many years. And then toward the end of his life, he became a theist. And he published a book that said, the title is "There is a God." But the way it was put on the cover, it was "There is no God," and "no" was crossed out and replaced with "a," because that was his story. And what he said, what Anthony Flew said, was that the argument for God is much stronger than the argument for atheism. And he said the two most important things that tipped the scales for him was about design and order in the physical universe and the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. So the question is not which religion has no doubt, which one still has doubt, which one has the most doubt or the least amount of doubt. It's the mix of doubt. So that's the third consideration I hope you consider. By the way, there's this amazing tiny little phrase toward the end of the Gospel of Matthew. I remember when I read it for the first time, I thought, what in the world is that doing there? It was after Jesus had made all these amazing claims about his life, and he told his disciples that he was going to die a sacrificial death, and he predicted his resurrection, and then he dies, and he rises from the dead, and then he's appearing to his disciples after his resurrection. And it says they met with him there, and some doubted. They saw him die. They saw his side being pierced with blood and water coming out. They knew that the Romans knew how to crucify people. They knew he was dead. They knew he was put in a tomb. And now they see him rise from the dead, and they say, but some doubted. And I think, okay, I can fit in there. I would be one of those going, do we really know? One of my favorite stories in the Bible is about so-called doubting Thomas. I call him realistic Thomas. Anyway, sorry. Fourth consideration. Okay, so I'm giving you some, I think that faith may be inevitable, not optional. We have to examine what our motives are like. Reasonable confidence is probably more realistic than absolute certainty. Fourth, we should consider that the differences between religions may be more helpful than their similarities. Looking at the differences between religions may be more helpful for us rather than their similarities. There is a very common belief that many people, I would probably think that most people in our culture believe, and that is that all religions are basically the same. They only disagree on minor little peripheral things. Sometimes people use this illustration. They say that all religions are just like different roads up the same mountain. Have you heard that illustration? It was first published in a comparative religious studies book by a religious studies scholar, Christopher Smith, and it became the accepted norm in all sorts of religious studies programs. Until about 10 years ago, a religious studies professor up at Boston University, Stephen Prothero, dared to question the status quo in his field, and he published a book that is entitled God is Not One: The 8 Rival Religions That Run the World and Why Their Differences Matter. Prothero's not a Christian. In fact, he says that he doesn't really hold to any particular religion. He's a student of religious studies. But what he said is, if you really examine different religions, they're not similar. They're amazingly different. In fact, he says in his book, they're not roads on the same mountain. They're not even on the same mountain. In the introduction, he says, Hindu teacher Swami Savananda writes, the fundamental or essentials of all religions are the same. There is difference only in the non-essentials. And then Prothero adds, this is a lovely sentiment, but it is dangerous, disrespectful, and untrue. And so I think what's far more helpful is to study different religions and see what is their unique thing. What is it that makes Buddhism different than Hinduism? What is it that is the essential element of Islam and Judaism and Christianity? And compare those things. It was when I started thinking in those terms that I saw some distinctives about the Christian faith that drew me in a very meaningful way. This became painfully aware to me not all that terribly long ago here at this very fine school, George Mason University, although when I say not very long ago, for me that means 20 years ago. For you, it's like, this is even more than that. Sorry. I started when I was only 4. I think I told you that last time. But anyway, so there's a school here at George Mason called the School of Conflict Analysis and Resolution. Are any of you in it? Oh no. Well, originally, yes, okay, great. So you know this. It started as an Institute of Conflict Analysis and Resolution, ICAR. And ICAR, some of you may have heard me tell the story. I'm sorry for the repeat, but it's therapeutic for me to keep telling it. My therapist says I'm making progress. And so at this ICAR conference, they invited 30 people of different religions to meet in I believe it was in this building, in a conference room. And we sat around this big kind of like conference table, 30 of us or so, and there was a Muslim man, a Buddhist man, it was like people of all sorts of different religions. And when they invited me, I knew one of the graduate students in the program, and he said, yeah, we're doing a program. It's called Conflict Analysis and Resolution and Religious Proselytizing, and we'd really like you to come. Now, if you're not familiar with the word proselytizing, it's like evangelism or witnessing. It's trying to tell people that they should believe what you believe. And the word proselytizing is not a very popular term. It's not a very positive term. When you call someone a proselytizer, it's not a compliment. And so I said to them, is that really what you're calling it? Conflict analysis and resolution and religious proselytizing? I said, you really might want to rethink that title. No, we really like that title. But he said, but you know, it's really funny, we're inviting people or whatever, and we're really having a hard time getting any evangelical Christians to come. Imagine that. By the way, Cru used to be called Campus Crusade for Christ. Can you think of a more sensitive term for going to a conference on religious proselytizing? Anyway, for some reason, maybe I had fallen or hit my head, I said yes, I would go. And so we get to the first, it's going to be 2 days long. Thursday from 9 to 5, Friday from 9 to 5, with lunch provided. It was really delicious. But at the very first meeting, we're going to go around the room and introduce ourselves. So different people taking turn. And so this one, say where you're from, what religious perspective you bring to the table, and why you're here. And so this one was here because they really want to stop Christians from trying to witness to them. And then this one is here from the Jewish community to really stop Christians from trying to witness to Jews. And then this one is like, and we're going around and I'm thinking, is there a trap door somewhere? Or, I just remembered I had to be somewhere else, anywhere else. But no, and so it gets around to me and I'm thinking, my name is Randy Newman and I work for a crusade. And I didn't think that was a good way to say it, but I did. And then I thought, I remembered a joke a friend told me, and I thought, oh, I know, I'll crack a joke. Because it's like really tense in the room, and nobody's happy, and nobody's smiling, and they're all looking at me because I'm the designated proselytizer. And so I said, yeah, I know the name Campus Crusade, it's not really all that sensitive or whatever. I have a friend who told me we should change our name to the Campus Jihad for Jesus. Nobody laughed. It was 9,000 degrees in the room. And, and I was just kidding, but it didn't matter. And so for 2 days, it was, somebody was getting it. So for 2 days, it was, yeah, this is bad. Randy, what do you think? Well, I don't think it's really that bad. Well, and so, it was really painful. So we finally get to the end of this, 5 minutes to 5 on Friday. And okay, so people are starting to put stuff away. They're, folding up things and putting them into backpacks or briefcases. And, the guy who's the facilitator starts saying, well, this has really been stimulating and interesting. And, but I think there's one thing we can all agree on, that different religions are like blind men coming to an elephant. And I thought, oh no. He's going to tell the blind man the elephant, it's 4 minutes to 5. There's traffic. And because you know the blind man and the elephant story, it was a favorite in religious studies classrooms. The idea is that 6 blind men all happen to come upon an elephant, which I think is an amazing coincidence. But it almost seems like divinely ordered. Never mind, sorry. So anyway, but 6 blind men all show up at an elephant at the same time. But because they're blind, they don't see the whole elephant. So the story goes that the guy who's at the side of the elephant goes, an elephant is like a wall. And the guy in the front with the tusk, no, an elephant's like a spear. And the guy who's holding the snake, the tail, says an elephant is like a snake. And then, and so the story is that nobody sees the whole elephant. And that's what different religions are. They're like blind men at the elephant. And it's now 2 minutes before 5, and out of the corner of my eye, I see a hand going up in the air. And to my horror, it was mine. And I thought, what are you doing up there? There's traffic. It's 2 minutes before 5. We want to all go home. But before I could do it, the guy who was facilitating said, Randy, do you have something to say? And I thought, well, I don't see how we could say that. He said, you don't see how we can say what? I said, I don't see how we can say that nobody sees, that none of those blind people, none of those religions see the whole elephant. He said, why not? I said, the only way we can say that is if we claim that we see the whole elephant. And there's like now it's 1,000 degrees in the room. And it's 2 minutes after 5 and people are really mad and no one's happy, including me. And he said, so what do you mean? I said, if we're claiming that we see the whole elephant, but all those religions are blind, then we're guilty of the very thing we're condemning them for. Because the whole point of this story is they see we should all be humble and not claim to see more than what we can see. And then I added, as if it wasn't bad enough, I said, and by the way, isn't that just like a little patronizing to say that all these religions are blind? But we were telling the story we see. Are we saying that Jesus is blind, and Muhammad was blind, and Buddha was blind, and now it's like midnight. I don't know what time it was. And the guy who was facilitating said, well, you've really given us something to think about. And does anybody else have anything? Nobody wanted to say anything. Thank you for coming. Goodbye. And we sang goodbye. No, we didn't sing. So, but I've thought about that ever since, and I thought, I just wish I could have taken 2 more minutes. Because here's what I would have wanted to say. Here's what I want to say. I would want to say, God sees the whole elephant, and he's told us what the elephant looks like. Now, he hasn't told us everything. He hasn't given us all of the answers. There still are unanswered questions. But God has revealed truth to us. And in fact, I think the uniqueness of the Christian faith is that God revealed truth to us by becoming a person. And so what is unique about the Christian religion is the very basis for us to have confidence, a very high level of confidence, that we can know this God. And that this Jesus is teaching about the fact that he came not just to reveal God to us so that we would understand him, but to die a sacrificial death so that our sins that had separated us from God can bring us back together with God. It's the most wonderful news. I want us to think about in this consideration, if wherever you're at on this spectrum, maybe it would be worth rethinking this whole issue if in fact faith is inevitable. We have different motives, we have multiple motives. We come at this with a sense of looking for confidence rather than certainty. And we should look at the uniqueness, the unique person of Jesus, and see what he had to say and what he did and why he came. So, I'm going to let you ask me some questions, and I'll try to do my best to answer concisely. But let me give an offer first. I work for the C.S. Lewis Institute now, so I'm obligated to always bring material by C.S. Lewis and quote him at least once. And so I brought this book that I really like. You've heard me mention, or I think I mentioned about Mere Christianity. It's one of his most famous books. It's probably one that has sold a tremendous amount. It has helped a lot of people think deeply. It has 4 parts to it. And I think that the first 2 parts are actually far more helpful for most people than the second 2 parts. And this book is just the second part. It's called What Christians Believe. It's nice and short. I brought a bunch of copies. And I want to say that if you're not a Christian, or if you're confused or wondering or searching this out, there'll be a copy on the back table, and please pick one up and take it with you. I also put my business card in there because I would love to hear from you, either after you read it or after you've had some comments about tonight. It's not a requirement. You don't have to. You could throw out the business card, although we paid money. Anyway, sorry. The Jewish in me still just wants to inflict guilt. I can't resist it. Go ahead, throw the cards out. No, really, it's fine. Sure, No, but I really would love to hear from you. I'm hoping that the content of what I've shared tonight will be part of the book that I'm writing. And so the more response I can get from people about what made sense, what didn't, what connected, what didn't, that would be helpful for me. So please, on your way out, like I said, take a book, grab a business card, email me, and we'll get together for coffee or something. So, I think I've got a little bit of just a few minutes for a Q&A. Do you have some questions that perhaps I can clarify something, or expand on something, or maybe just something that has triggered an idea about? Yes.
So how can we use skepticism as a way to drive confidence?
How can we use skepticism to what?
Drive confidence.
Drive confidence? I like that. So I'm thinking of skepticism in a large category of lots and lots of questions. So I think we need to be really honest about questions and pursue them and try to answer them the best way we can and get the best help from people who thought about this deeply and written about it. So I know that in some Christian circles, asking questions is discouraged. Oh, don't ask those questions. Just believe in Jesus; He'll take care of your questions. I think that's really foolish. It doesn't sound like the Bible to me. It doesn't sound like Jesus, and it doesn't sound like some of the most thoughtful people who have investigated and found out answers. So I think if you are skeptical or you have questions, try to think clearly about what the question is. A lot of questions don't help you move forward because they can be kind of vague, and so what we need to do is try to clarify, okay, what is it that I'm asking? Sometimes writing it down is really helpful. Sometimes conversing with someone where you kind of throw out a question, they go, are you asking this? I'm like, no, that's not really, it's more like this. And so try to clean up the question and get it to be in the state where it's most helpful. and then try to get the best answers that you can find. There are a lot of great resources today for answering questions. Or let me do a commercial. And it's not for C.S. Lewis. But I just heard this afternoon a presentation downtown by a woman named Rebecca McLaughlin. She's written a book called Confronting Christianity, 12 Hard Questions for the World's Greatest Religion. I think it is fantastic. I think it's just a very, very honest, real wrestling with very, very important issues. Check out Rebecca McLaughlin on YouTube, and she's also a great speaker. She can be very helpful. Thanks. Another question? Yes.
What would you say to someone within the case they're working in their identity is science, and they're aware that they work on reasoning about is there any way
Hold it. Let me just interrupt you. Greg and I know each other pretty well, so we interrupt each other all the time. So this is just usual for us. Sorry but formulating a question is a very important part of the process. And a lot of times, for a lot of us, we need to do exactly what you're doing. What is it that I'm trying to ask? So keep going. But you're modeling very well for all of us. So that's the luck to you. Let's see how this goes.
I guess what I'm asking is, so I want to appeal to something. I want to tell this individual in life that he's more than something else, which he flatly thinks to be. What would you do in an evangelist or apologizing for an evangelistic setting like that? Like, how would I use it?
Well, the whole intersection of science and faith has a long history to it, and it's very, very good. I think it's fairly recent where people have started to assume, oh, you can't be both scientific and a person of faith or a Christian. But when I did Christian gatherings of Christian professors here at this campus, always more than half of them were scientists. And I was connected with a bunch of people who did similar things on other campuses. Always, the majority of Christian professors are scientists. So, science admits what it can do and what it can't do. Science can do tremendous things, and I'm very grateful for that, especially in the field of science of medicine. But science doesn't answer a lot of the why questions. And so good scientists say, this is what we can study, this is what we can answer, and then questions about purpose and meaning in life, and why do I have certain feelings, and but why is it that sometimes I experience something that I would call brokenheartedness? My heart is broken. Science doesn't help me understand that as well as faith, religion, understanding that aspect of life. So there's a lot of good things written about science and faith today, and you can find some good things online. A great name, if this is a question of yours about science and faith, I think the best name of someone I'd recommend is John Lennox. And John Lennox has a number of different YouTube videos and some good books. He wrote a book called God's Undertaker. Has science buried God? And he says no. So, spoiler alert. But I think he's a great thinker and a great writer, and is very compassionate for people who have difficult questions. So, yes?
How do you approach someone who, how do you approach someone who is saying that they can't believe in a good God in the world in so much pain?
Well, that's the question I wrestle with a lot. It was the biggest struggle for me before becoming a Christian. I think what we have to realize is that the problem of evil and suffering is a problem for everyone. It's not just a problem for religious people. Atheists have a problem with evil. Oh, good. Why don't I just quit now? So we all have a problem with the problem of evil. And in the history of the world, people have only been able to deal with that 4 or 5 different ways. I mean, so there's an atheist way, there's a Christian way, there's a Buddhist way, there's a sort of a secular humanist way, and they all have strengths and weaknesses, but they're all incomplete. I think that the Christian one is the best of the incomplete answers. So what I think we need to do is be honest about looking at, well, how have people dealt with this? So we did do an event here at George Mason, again, probably 100 years ago, on that very issue. And we co-sponsored it with the Philosophy Club. It was a philosophy club, and it was an issue about evil and suffering. And there were 2 Christian philosophers and 2 atheist philosophers. The event was actually in Atlanta, and it was typed by satellite. I think you're watch it. Very interesting, very philosophical, rather in-depth. The next day I had lunch with the faculty member who was the faculty advisor for the Philosophy Club. Philosophy professor I'd gotten to know, he was an atheist. And I said to him, so how do you think things went last night? And he said, well, it was okay, I just don't think the Christians really had a good answer. And I thought, well, my first thought was, here, let me try. And then I thought, well, no, those 2 brilliant guys who took 2 hours, they didn't do it. One of them was a guy named William Lane Craig. Another guy was Bobby Zacharias. These are like some pretty big names in science and philosophy. And I was thinking, well, they're Slavics, they didn't know. Let me try. No, but then I stopped myself and went, oh. Okay, so you weren't convinced last night. I said, okay, so you're an atheist, right? I said, yes. And I said, what's the atheist answer to the problem of evil? And he said, well, we don't really have a very good one either. I said, oh, okay. And then we had a great discussion comparing our incomplete answers. And I freely admitted to him that I still think the Christian answer, I think is the best, but it still leaves a whole chunk of, gee, I don't know. I mean, I get to the end of the book of Job, and I'm disappointed. And I see things in the New Testament where Paul says he prays for deliverance from this, and then God says, for my grace is sufficient for you. So I think we have an incomplete answer. But I think the Christian answer helps us with power to get through difficult times, and is the best of the incomplete answers. By the way, I'm going over to dinner to that philosophy professor's house next Sunday. I think that's really cool. We've kept in touch. There's still interesting talking. I'm getting old. It's good. Unless what that means is stop talking. The MC's in the back standing. When the MC's standing, it's always like a bad sign. So maybe like 1 or 2 more questions. So yes.
I understand that you think that questions of religion is perspective. I don't know. Do you believe that other religions can exist and have their own truth? So do you believe that Christianity is virtue and other religions to you exist and that they peacefully exist, coexisting, and you that they're peaceful?
Let me first address the word coexist. I think we do coexist. We have to coexist. We live in a world with people of different religions, so we already are coexisting. I think what we want is more than that. We want understanding and appreciation. I do think other religions have a whole lot of truth in them. I just happen to think that the Christian one has the best answer. So I do think other religions have truth in them, and we can learn a whole lot from them. But I think the death and resurrection of Jesus sets Christianity apart by being a better solution for the problem of sin, a better solution for the problem of alienation from God. So, that may be all I could say. But if you want to talk some more, I'd love to. And I think.
It's been, I don't know, for a while,
Well, no, I'm really glad that you spoke, and I'm really glad that you expressed that. I think, but the process, but for me, moving from I don't believe this at all to I do believe was 4 years. So a lot of wrestling, and so I think other religions can help us understand how different perspectives go after the same problem. Again, I happen to think that Jesus claims to be unique, claims to be the Son of God, claims to have a death that solves our deepest problem, is the best approach. But we can talk some more about it. Yeah. It's really important again for you to be honest. I hope I'm not embarrassing you.
Oh,
You know,
sorry.
but so you're being honest about your motivations. So one of your motivations was some not so great experiences growing up and that pushed you away. I think that's really, really important for a lot of people to look at that and go, oh, so that's what's going on there. That's why my response may be stronger in the emotional side than it should be or needs to be. And maybe I need to rethink that and not let my past dominate. Isn't it kind of ironic that when something painful from our past dominates, in fact, we're letting it continue to have its effect on us? And a very big, important part, I think, of emotional health is saying, wait a minute, I don't have to let these things control me. So now I'm slipping into psychology, and somebody said that's not what I signed up for. I think I saw one hand, another over here. No? Oh, in the way back. Okay, so this is it. Now, don't feel any pressure, but this is the last question, so it's got to be brilliant. Or at least the answer to it.
So I sometimes have difficulty knowing what aspects of my faith to test. I don't want to leave any stone unturned. So how do I go about analyzing my beliefs and revealing which of them are assumptions?
All right, I want to make sure I understand the question. So you don't want to leave any stone unturned
In terms of my faith.
in terms of faith.
Right. Because I've had some wonderful conversations with friends on the other side of the spectrum and some on my side of the spectrum. And I make this claim and then they press it and I realize, oh, wait a minute, I'm making this assumption. So what ways can I go about finding these assumptions in my beliefs?
So it really helps, I think, to have a conversation partner or several. A small group discussion or one-on-one conversation helps clarify. It's really good to have a friend who cares about you enough to kind of point out some things that you might not want to see. It's really good to have people in our lives who will say things like, is that really the biggest deal? Well, they will probably say it nicer. I'm working on the kind voice. It's not going very well. I have a granddaughter now who, when I read to her, she'll regularly say to me, Grandpa, use your kind voice. And so I'm trying to develop the kind voice, but it's like a foreign language for me. So anyway, so you need a friend who will say, okay, which ones are the really big deals? And which ones are not so big? And which ones do you really need to go after and which ones don't you? There are a whole lot of questions we come up with, and they're questions, they're real, but they may not be important, or they may not be of the highest importance. And so you need to sort of prioritize them and see, okay, which ones do I really need to get resolved, and which ones maybe I'm not going to. With the realistic expectation, like I said, that you may not get every answer that you're looking for. So, okay, I need to quit. I'll tell you what, I'll stick around afterwards if some of you want to ask me some more questions. I would love to get together with some of you and converse about this. Again, I think that kind of conversation helps me clarify my thinking, and perhaps I can be helpful to you. Thanks, it's been great to be with you.